Sharon. Thanks you guys for having me. Thank you also for your patience. I think we had this scheduled 2 or 3 months ago, and I had some kind of conflict come up, and you guys were very patient and kind and found another slot for me to fill in. So I'm happy to be with you guys. I love Kansas City. I'm not exactly sure why. It's just every time I go there, good things seem to happen. Good people come out of there all the time. So one of my best friends and neighbors from Kansas City as well. So I'm happy to be with you virtually. Hope to be with you in person someday. So we're going to talk about robotic process automation, or what Microsoft is currently calling UI flows. So as Sharon said, it's a somewhat new area. Microsoft kind of did some pre-release stuff starting about a year ago, and it's evolved a lot since then. So let's jump right in. There's kind of a lot of content to cover here. Let's see if my clicker is going to work for me. So I don't know if this situation looks and feels familiar to many of you. I know for me, it's something we run into pretty regularly in spite of all the awesome automation and integration tools and things like that we have available to us now. There's still a lot of clients we run into who go, yeah, I do something over here, and then I copy it and I paste it over here, and there's like 20 fields here, so I have to paste all of them in over here. And then someone else downstream has to kind of do the same thing on some other kind of app. And then it's all exported to Excel, but then it gets imported into some other database at the end of this whole string of things. This actual image comes from a client that is in the restaurant business who had something very similar to this going on, where they said, we have a system that we maintain our video menu displays in. So this is kind of a large chain. So you go in and you see the menus up on videos, but we also print menus and have those in, kind of the laminated covers that, a couple of times a year we update all of those. And then we have our menu available online as well. And all the ways they need to get those to the printer or up on the video display or onto the website are all these different end systems. And so there's all this back and forth between all these systems to kind of create the menu, but then redo it in a lot of different formats to make it available. And some of those systems are very old legacy systems that don't have good, strong APIs to get information into them. That's one use case. We run into that time and time and time again, and I'm guessing you guys run into it as well. And by the way, I don't see chat here, so if you guys can feel free to interrupt me, or if someone has a burning question, ask, or I'll take questions at the end too, but I won't see them pop up as I talk. So let's bring this to a little bit of a simpler use case to start with. So we're also a Dynamics shop. We do a lot of things with Dynamics, the CRM side of Dynamics, not the accounting side of Dynamics. But many of our clients, including one in Texas that we're working with right now, have very outdated ERP systems. The one I'm thinking about in Texas at the moment literally has an AS400 ERP application that they've been using for many years to do their ERP work. They'll probably be using for many more years into the future. And in their process, they essentially say, hey, when an opportunity, so for those of you who don't know Dynamics, an opportunity is something in the sales pipeline that hopefully will become a quote and eventually an invoice and turn into revenue for the company. So when the sales rep says, I've won this opportunity, somebody in customer care, is how they handle it, literally has that opportunity open, and they open the ERP application, and they have to rekey the information that's in the opportunity into the ERP application. And technically, yes, you could go behind the scenes and do some industrial strength integration for it, but it's a really messy API to do that. So this is the integration they do, right? You might have heard this term, swivel chair integration, where it's really a human kind of doing this repetitive process again and again, taking information out of one system, keying it into another system. And it happens again and again and again. I'll give you some more examples as we get in, but I wanted to use that one to start with. Robotic process automation is about automating that. And it's a little different. If you're used to using Power Automate, you might think, well, how's that different from Power Automate? That's what Power Automate already does. You'll see as I get deeper into this how Power Automate and robotic process automation are different but complementary. But the heart of this is, if it's something a user can do repetitively, but it's not easy to automate using standard Power Automate tools, robotic process automation very well may be able to do it. If a user can do it on their screen and on their keyboard and it's repetitive, then you can train a robot to do it, a UI flow type of robot. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to walk through this demo that's about to go through here, this is actually an RPA, so robotic process automation or UI flow that I set up. That's this exact process we just talked about. So forgive me, the screen is a little bit tiny as we do it, but try to squint and look at it, and I think you can make out most of the details. This is all recorded, so I'm just going to kind of play it. So here I am on the opportunity, as I talked about before. I do a drop down, I go to flows, and I can actually pick a UI flow or a Power Automate to run against it. So I selected a Power Automate and I clicked run. And so what this Power Automate does behind the scenes is it says, I need to simulate what this user is doing. So the first thing I need to do is I need to log in to Dynamics. Even though the user is already logged in, because of security, I've got to re-log in. So there it just typed in the user ID and password automatically for me. And now it's starting to play back keystrokes. So it starts on the opportunity form. It looks at the form, it grabs some data off that form. On the opportunity form, it clicks the company name, goes to the company form, grabs some information about the company on the form, goes back to the opportunity, clicks the contact name, goes to the contact form, grabs some information about the contact. It's stored all of that information it grabbed about the company, the contact, and the opportunity in its memory. And now it says, now I need to open the accounting application. Now I've simulated the accounting application here with Microsoft Excel. So it's opening up Microsoft Excel. It keys in the specific file name that it needs to open. And you literally saw it keying that in very fast, but keying that in. And now it says, okay, all that information I got from Dynamics, I'm going to type that into this accounting application. So you can see it's on a company info tab here. It's typing in each of those pieces of information that it got from the Dynamics account page, one after the other. And again, all this, it looks like a user is doing this. It is not. It is literally the computer doing all of this. And I'm just sitting back watching it do this as a user now that I've trained it. Now it goes to the contact tab, enters information about the contact that this opportunity is with, so I can get in touch with them. And again, this is Excel, but hypothetically, this would be maybe a green screen AS400 application or something like that. And then lastly, it goes to the order information tab, and it's going to click in information about the order. So I know this demo looked kind of like, well, did you just kind of type everything in? It looks like you were just watching us run your keystrokes in fast motion. That's kind of what robotic process automation is. It looks at the screen just like a user. It uses the keyboard just like a user to repeat what the user does. And in this case, it left the accounting application open so that the user could actually now physically go in and work in that application. So the nice thing about it is it was 100% correct about all the data that it entered because it got it in a reliable way. It didn't rely on a human rekeying it in. It rekeyed it in on its own. And it was very fast. It didn't require a human to do work that a computer could really do for them. So today's goals. First of all, the audience for today's stuff that I kind of wrote it for is the business analyst and the solution architect. So to me, business analyst might be that person who says, look, I'm not the hands-on technical person, but I at least want to know how all of this works. So as I help look at business problems going on in my business, I know what the solutions are that I can work with, but I may never actually get hands-on with it. But also for that solution architect person, that person who may not be a developer, but is pretty technically strong, has maybe done a lot of SharePoint configuration or work in Dynamics or Power App development or something like that. And they're saying, I'm a hands-on person, and I want to push in the right direction. I'm not going to give you every bit of training because we don't have time, but a solid push in the right direction so you can get up and running and starting to use these right away and hopefully get around a lot of the little nuances that gave me headaches as I got started in this process. So your takeaways hopefully will be you're going to understand what is RPA and UI flows, how are those different from regular Power Automate, how can you build that Power Automate, that UI flow I just showed you. We're going to walk through exactly how to build that, but not only that, why would you do it that way versus some other way? I'll share some of the headaches with you, and at the end I'm going to talk about what built this that was wrong. It's intentionally wrong because I wanted to demonstrate something to you that it worked out well, that I did it the wrong way, but I want you to understand the best practice way to actually have built that. So you'll learn all of those things as well as some of the new up and coming things. So a couple of slides, I'm going to get into the hands-on walkthrough of this. It's going to be very slide oriented, not a lot of clicking in the application itself, but you'll have the step-by-step instructions. But a little more background on this first of all. So you may be familiar with the term business process automation. Microsoft's been doing that for a long time. Power Automate is a BPA tool. SharePoint Workflows is a BPA tool. Robotic process automation, Microsoft is pretty new to that, but it's been around for quite a while. BPA uses APIs, right? So application programming interface. If you're not familiar with that term, API is basically just a way of saying, how can one computer program talk to another computer program? There's this interface made so that they can swap information and execute tasks in different systems and stuff like that without a user involved. The user interface is the mouse, the keyboard, and the monitor. RPAs use the user interface. They do not use the API. That's why I say if a user can do it using the interface they have into the computer and it's repetitive, you can probably do it with RPA. You might also be able to do it with BPA, and we'll talk about when you would use each towards the end of this. So some examples, a BPA example, if you have a Microsoft form and you want to put the content of that form into a Power App or into a SharePoint list or something like that, BPA is what you could use for that. There's APIs. I'm way overdoing the acronym, sorry. There's APIs to make that super, super simple. An example of a robotic process automation is maybe you've got data in Dynamics and you need to move it to a legacy ERP application. No API exists, or it's a difficult to deal with API. That might be a good candidate for an RPA type of application. More on that as we get a little bit deeper into it. But trying to kind of give you a few more examples. In the BPA world, you guys probably already know a lot about SharePoint workflows. So maybe a legacy SharePoint workflow, that's an example of BPA. A modern version of that would be a Power Automate approval. And you kind of get the idea that with that, you get a lot more flexibility, right? Not just a broader tool set, but I can connect my approvals to anything, not just to content or SharePoint list web parts, but anything, anywhere that Power Automate can connect to. So that's the evolution of BPA. RPA, to help you understand it a little bit better, if you have ever recorded a keystroke macro in Excel, or if you're an old guy like me, we used to do it in other applications back in the 90s. But that's a robotic process automation. Literally, I click record macro, I do some stuff in Excel, I stop recording, I open up the little designer interface, and I see all my keystrokes are in there, and I can call them back anytime I want. I can edit them to do other things. A Power Automate UI flow is the evolution of that. And just like a SharePoint approval workflow evolved to be much more flexible with a Power Automate approval, a UI flow can connect up multiple different applications, not just to Excel, but virtually anything the user can interact with on their desktop. A Power Automate UI flow can now interact with as well, plus a lot of programming tools or low-code, no-code tools for the more, I'm not fond of the term citizen developer, but that technical person who's not necessarily a developer, but can work with logical flows on their own, lots of tools to be able to do that. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of a framework for what the difference is between them. Now, Microsoft has been in the BPA space for a long, long time, right? Where you talked about SharePoint workflows were BPA tools. Dynamic CRM, which formed the basis for model-driven Power Apps, been around for a long time and has been a BPA type of system. And Microsoft, as a result, is rated is rated in that Magic Quadrant, if you're familiar with the Magic Quadrant rating system, for one of the best BPA providers in the world. However, if you look at RPA, Microsoft's not even on the list. They're not in the Magic Quadrant. They're not even on the list because they just entered the market about a year ago. However, in the spring of this year, Microsoft purchased another company called Softomotive, which created a solution called Win Automate. Softomotive, if you look at this Magic Quadrant, wasn't quite in the Magic Quadrant, but pretty darn close to it. Microsoft grabbed them up in the spring. By the time they grabbed them up, were already doing some UI flows, but Softomotive added to this. So Microsoft is well on their way to probably being in that Magic Quadrant. If I were making a prediction, I'd say in the next 12 to 24 months, Microsoft will probably be in that Magic Quadrant. But it's an interesting time because we have the old school UI flows that are supported and in production now. And then we've got the new types of UI flows that Microsoft just announced as a part of Ignite. Those are still in preview mode. So I'm going to focus on the ones that have been around for a little longer. But towards the end, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about the newer ones as well. So you kind of have a background in how all of these things work. Okay, so that's all the backgrounder stuff. Let's talk now about how do you build UI flows. And really, in my reckoning, it's really kind of a three-step process, right? You're going to record things. So you're going to record what the user does. You're going to refine those things, and then you're going to put them into production. You're going to run those things. So 3 R's, I like silly acronyms. So you record first. So unlike other Power Automates or a lot of other things you might design, you don't necessarily observe the process and then try to wire it together. Instead, you say, look, I'm literally going to sit down in front of Dynamics. I'm going to start recording. I'm going to let it capture my keystrokes and where I'm looking on the monitor and all that stuff. I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to sit down in front of my ERP application. I'm going to capture all my keystrokes again. And then I'm going to kind of knit those 2 recordings together and edit them a little bit to make them more efficient. So let's walk through how you go through that process now, starting with the recording. So very first thing, to create your first UI flow recording, go into Power Automate just like you would normally go into Power Automate. In Power Automate, you can see my little numbered teardrops there. Go down to My Flows, click the tab over UI Flows. You'll probably see a little blinking idea button near it if you've never gone into it before, because Microsoft wants you to see that it's there. Then click the new button. When you click the new button, you're going to be hit with a dialog. This dialog has changed recently. So if you say, hey, I've been there before, if it's been more than about a month since you've been there, this experience is going to be a little bit different for you. So this is what I see when I say I'm going to create a UI flow. I have 3 options for how I'm going to create it. I can either create the new type, a Power Automate desktop. If you see PAD, that seems to be the acronym we're now using for it. That's in preview mode. That's the latest iteration of the Softomotive Win Automation ones. So if you've ever used that before, it looks a lot different now, but Microsoft is bringing that technology into Power Automate. You can also do a Windows recorder session. So these are the ones that have been around for about a year. It was the first one that Microsoft rolled out. You choose that second one if you're saying, I have a Windows application, I want to automate it. It runs on my desktop, it does not run in a web browser. So that's where you'd go, whether you're entering information into a Windows application or you're taking information out of a Windows application. That's the kind of UI flow you would create. Or the third one is the Selenium IDE. So IDE stands for Interactive Development Environment. If that sounds a little scary because it sounds very developer-esque, it is technical, but I'm not a developer. I was able to get in there and do some things with it. Now, I'm also not a super low-tech user either, so be advised of that. Different personas may fit better into these things. Selenium IDE is actually a third-party public-based application that's been around for a lot of years. People have been using it for testing web apps and stuff like that. So again, as you look at these 3, top one, new school, does a lot of things. I'm going to conclude with that. Bottom 2, they're out of preview and in full production. You're going to click the first one, Windows Recorder. If you're integrating with a Windows app, you're going to click Selenium IDE if you're integrating with a web-based app. Now, you may be thinking, well, Jeff, your app was both web and Windows, right? You got stuff out of CRM, the web app, but you put it into a Windows-based app, Excel or whatever that desktop application for ERP might have been. What would I do in that case? You would actually create 2 UI flows. So you create the one that you're getting data from first. In my situation, that was the Selenium IDE, a web app. Then you'd create a UI flow for the one you're putting the data into. That would be Windows Recorder. Now, just to kind of flash forward a little bit, Power Automate Desktop, the preview mode one in the very beginning, that allows you to connect to both desktop and web-based applications. So I think it's the future. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it is still in preview mode too. So it's got some gotchas associated with it. Now, whichever one of these 3 things you click to get started, you're going to have some installation to do. So each one of these installs a web add-on to integrate with your browser and or desktop environment. So I won't go through all that. You only have to do it the very first time. So you go and you create a UI flow, you get the pop-up, you choose one of these, the next thing you're going to get is another pop-up saying, hey, it doesn't look like I can talk to your desktop yet. I need to install this other thing. Go through that process. You won't have to go through it again unless you're on another machine, having to run the process again. And it's a pretty seamless install to get it set up on your desktop. This part's simple. There's a little more tricky part coming up here. Okay. So backing up, remembering the example I walked you through, the first thing I do is to get data, I open up Dynamics 365 CRM so I can get data out of the account, opportunity, and contact forms or entities within that application. So I've clicked the Selenium IDE option here, because this is a web application that I want to get information from. I now get this dialog, and I just put in the flow name, whatever I want to name it. I also put in a base URL. So it basically says, look, I know you're going to be, this is a web app, so tell me the base URL you're going to start with. It does not have to be the same URL every time. So if I run this again and again, I do have the ability to change that URL at runtime. But while I'm designing it and recording my keystrokes, it's saying, give me an example one that I can go to get you started. So in this case, I just said, okay, I opened up an opportunity in Dynamics. I grabbed the URL of that opportunity. I pasted it in here so it would run. And then I clicked the launch recorder button. Remember I said you always start by recording. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I need to record what is happening inside of this app. So on the left hand here, you can see this is Selenium IDE. This is the interactive developer environment for Selenium. There is a ton you can do with this. There are all sorts of commands you can call. I've only scratched the surface of them myself. However, there's tons of online documentation for it, but the simple thing is you can just hit the record button. So if you look, it's very tiny up there, but if you look at the one teardrop up there, you can see it's pointing at the record button. So you just click that record button to begin recording what you're doing in that application. So I click that button. Now the next thing that happened is it popped open that URL. Remember I gave it the base URL, so it says, okay, you're going to record. Boom, I'm going to open up this URL that you want to start doing something with. That's the opportunity in Dynamics. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click the account link there, because I know as a user what I do is from this form, I got to go get information about the account. So I click the account link, and it's going to open up the account record in Dynamics where I'm going to go copy some information off of that form. Once I click that link, you can actually see back over on the left side, Selenium IDE has updated with a little bit of information for me. So if I kind of call this out a little bit, first of all, you can kind of see that it said, okay, I'm opening up this URL that you gave me as my base URL. I'm doing a screen size here, which I think it just does by default. And then it says, okay, you clicked. And here is the funky ID from the web browser that you clicked. So it's like, that's what that account link, that's what the ID is. So I know when I want to play back this keystroke later, this click later, I know where I'm going to click on that page. So all I did was hit record, and boom, it put that in there for me. Now I can also, under the number 3 teardrop here, I can hit stop to now go in and edit this recording a little bit to add other stuff to it. For instance, it doesn't know, well, what are those fields I was getting information from, right? Yes, I know you're on this page, but I can't tell what the user is, looking at with their eyes or something like that. I have to tell it about that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's add some commands to the Selenium IDE here. So I've got the one I already had. You can kind of see I'm on the click item here that it captured from the user experience. I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to, number 2 teardrop there, I'm going to insert a new command at this point. What command am I going to insert? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this one down here under the number 3 teardrop, the store value. So basically I'm saying there's a value on this form somewhere that I want you to capture and store and remember because I want to use it later. The next thing it says is, okay, well, tell me, where is that? What's the target? Where is that value on this page? The number 4 teardrop here, to get that value, I click this little pointer and it goes back into edit mode. And using the pointer, I just come over and I click on this field. I want to get the name of the company. I think that's what I'm looking at, right? I know the topic name of the opportunity. So I want to get the topic name of it. So I just click on that. And then it's going to fill this in again with the gobbledygook ID of that field on the web form. So it says, okay, this is what your web application is calling that field that you just clicked on. And by the way, when I hover over that, it kind of highlights in a box for me. So it's very clear that I'm on the thing that I want to get. And then I'm going to give a name to that opportunity, to that value, right? So I'm going to say, well, where am I going to store this information? I'm going to store it in this field called op type, okay, the type of opportunity. So I'm going to give it a name there so I can reference it later. Now notice up here, by the way, for the URL, I have a different type of way that I'm storing information because this is an input variable. This is something that the web app is receiving. This is an output variable. This is something I'm going to save for later. So remember how I told you that the base URL can be changed. So I didn't want to just have a hard-coded URL up here. I want a value that the developer, that the user can set at runtime and change depending on what opportunity I'm on at any given time. So I created an input variable there. And you'll see how I populate that in a little while. But I also go create output variables for each item I want to grab off the pages. So now I go to each one of those pages, march around each one of those pages, and I add commands here. I keep adding that store value command. So you can kind of see, if you look at this, my recording part of this were really just these guys where I said, I'm just going to capture mostly my clicks as I click on the opportunity, and then I click on the account, then I click back on the opportunity, then I click on the contact, because I need to have those forms, each of those 3 forms, visible so that I can grab the values I need to off of the form. But then I use the one-off insert a command to add all of these store value commands in here to navigate around those pages and say, grab this item, grab this item, grab this item, grab this item. And I'm remembering all of those. Now, the nice thing about this environment is it is an interactive development environment and allows me to debug as well. So once I've built my whole web app flow, my Selenium flow here, I can go to the top and I can hit play. And it will just go back and play through all of my keystrokes, and it'll even show you values getting stored and stuff like that. So I can just double check to say, is it really going everywhere I thought? Is it moving around the pages in the right time? It's not getting hung up anywhere. Okay, this is working. So when I'm all done, I just go click the little disk icon over here, and now it's saved it. And that save is going to appear under the UI flows. Remember how we got to UI flows to begin with? Power Automate, My Flows, UI flows. You'll now see that one in the list of UI flows. It's all saved in there. Cool. So now I've said, okay, now I've set up how I'm going to get information from one application. Now I want to figure out how to put information that I captured into another. And I made this a desktop application, partly because I wanted you to see the experience of these 2 different ways of building things. So now I'm saying, okay, I'm going to create a new UI flow, same way I did before, new UI flow. I'm going to say this time it's a Windows UI flow. So I click that. I need to name the UI flow. I get a little dialog box similar to the last one, give it a name, go ahead and click next and jump in. The first thing when I create a desktop UI flow app is it says, what are the input variables that you want for this desktop app? Now, this is not required. You might say, I'm only getting values from this desktop app, so there's nothing to input into it at all. That's fine. Skip the step if that's the case. In our case, I knew I had a bunch of information I want to put into this application. So I created each one of those variables up front as an input variable. And you can kind of see I kind of create a name for that variable, and I create a sample value for that variable, and I can create a description for it as well. And in this case, the name and description were the same. I didn't really differentiate those, but you can have a more detailed description if you want to. So I said, here's these 12 or 15 different values. I know I want to key into this application. I need to tell this app about these before I go on to record my keystrokes and place that information into it. Once I've created those values, I click the next button, and I'm going to get kind of looks like a Power Automate right here, looking a little familiar anyway. But now it says, okay, it's time for you to record what you want to do here. So within this step, you can see I've got the Launch Recorder button. I just click Launch Recorder. And again, the first time it will have installed the recorder on your desktop. When you click Launch Recorder, you're going to get this as a drop down on your desktop. So literally that will drop down from the very top of your desktop environment, and you'll be able to interact with it to record anything going on in your desktop at all. When it first drops down, you only have one button to choose from, the record button. Start recording what I'm doing. Once it's active, you can use input, so you can place things into the application that were inputs. You can get output. You can find something in the application, copy it, remember it for later, and then you can say that you're done, pause it, and move on. So in my case, I said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and click the record button. I'm going to go open Microsoft Excel, my hypothetical accounting application, and I'm going to start putting information in it. And you can see to do that, all I did was I said, okay, with my accounting application open here, I now went in and said, okay, I'm going to use an input. I said, which input? These are the inputs I told it about when I first created this. I said, which input am I going to put in here? The company name. Where am I going to put it? I just click on the place where it goes. It knows, okay, I'm going to type that information into that box. Now, if I wanted to get something out of this application, I could use get output. But in this case, there's nothing I want out of this application. All I want to do is put stuff into it. So all I'm going to do is use input. Now, to To be totally clear here, remember way back when I did the web app, I was creating outputs. These inputs are in no way at this time connected to those outputs. They will be, and I'll show you how to do it. But this stands alone. These are just the variables I created for the desktop application. And as I click things in here, it's actually typing that sample data in for me so I can see it working, doing things the way I'm hoping that it will do things. When I'm all done, I click done. So I've put all my information in there. I've clicked the tabs in the Excel to move from tab to tab as I'm done entering things. Whatever I would do as a normal user, I do inside of this application. When I'm done, I click done. And this is what it generates. Now, this looks like really intimidating and it's super, super tiny. Remember in Selenium, it had that long list of everywhere I clicked and everywhere I copied information from. That's all that this is. And if I zoom in on one of those, you can kind of see it'll actually do a screen grab of what I was doing at the time. So I clicked on left click 3 up there and it expanded it and said, here's what I saw on your screen when you executed this command. In this case, I was actually left clicking inside here to type the file name for the Excel document that I wanted to open. And then right below it, you can kind of see, okay, this is the box I'm typing that value into. So just like the web experience from Selenium, I can go into this and I can interactively edit this to get a, whoops, I clicked somewhere I shouldn't have, and then I clicked in the right place, and I've got this extraneous click there that I don't really need. Okay, I can go delete that click if I need to. So I can do some basic cleanup, making it efficient, making sure everything flows the way that it should. Lots of steps for something relatively simple, but that's just kind of helps you understand that's what the user actually goes through to make all of that happen. When I'm done with that, the next thing I can do is I can review my outputs. Remember, I had no outputs in this case, but had I declared any outputs, which I do interactively while I'm creating that recording, those would appear here and I can look at them and say, okay, have I named them correctly? Is the right data in them? All of those things. No outputs for me, so I just click to the next step. And so now it goes into test mode. So now it says still on just my desktop app, no connection to my web app at all. As far as Power Automate knows, these are two completely different things. But it says, okay, let's test this desktop application. Here are all the inputs you told me about at the beginning of this recording. And here are all the test values, the default values I put in there. You can change those test values if you want to now. But when you click the Test Now button down there near the bottom, it's going to play back my automation. So I can go through and kind of do all my debugging and then say, okay, test now and see, does it open up Excel? Does it open the right file? Does it key the right information to the right places? If not, click back and do some more editing until everything works the way it should. And when you're done, you click the Save button. So that's it. That's the overall recording experience for the two in production non-preview versions of UI flows. Again, we'll come back to the last one near the end. So some overall observations about that. First of all, there are 3 different applications total. I've shown you 2. I'll show you the third one in a little while. But that's a little potentially overwhelming. Took me as a fairly technical person a little while to figure out when do I use these and why, and how do I use 2 of them together, which we'll talk about later. But it's a little bit of a learning curve for a non-technical user to say, I build Selenium automations one way with its own programming construct and its own interface, and I build desktop UI flows another way with its own user interface that feels kind of similar to Power Apps, but more in design only. There's a lot of nuances to it. There's also a lot of limitations with editing. So I can't go into a UI flow, for instance, that I've saved and say, save as. I need to validate that. Last time I looked, which was several months ago, I couldn't do that. So if I say, you know, I've got one, it's close, but I want to edit it, and I don't want to mess up my source code, if you will, I can't save as and just start editing. I have to either edit the one I have in place and risk botching it up, or create an entirely new one, going through the entire recording process all over again. So there's a lot of trial and error with it, particularly when you very first get started and you kind of learn some of the nuances around it. It is a premium connector. So just because you have a Power Automate license does not mean you have a functioning UI flow license. We can talk about that at the end. So I would contend these are not for non-technical users. I think it can be for strong administrators, strong solution architects, technical people that aren't necessarily developers, but sometimes I think these are billed as, you know, hey, anybody can just sit down and go, oh my gosh, I do this 50 times a day. Let me hit record and just record it and then play it back and it'll play again and again. Probably not going to happen all that often unless you've got a technical end user who knows how to think about those things. With web recording, it can be a little nuanced, and this is actually more a function of very complex, sophisticated websites, but you can easily click in the wrong part of the website, and maybe you grab the border around a field instead of the content within the field. So spend some time debugging it, and actually the Selenium environment is a little more forgiving to the debugger than the desktop environment is. So that's good news. Selenium does require using some programming language. As you saw, I had to know to go in and say, oh, I want to call a function, and the function I want to call is store value. Now, I'll pull up a list of all those, so I don't have to just type it in from memory, but there's a long, long list of things you can do in there. And that's good news and bad news. It's powerful. There's a lot you can do with it, but it's a little overwhelming when you need to do simple things, which to me, most of the time, I just want to get and put values more than anything. And it is a third-party app, which again, good news, bad news. It's not an official Microsoft app, although they've wrapped it up nicely in the UI flow interface, but it's been around for a long time and it's mature. I'd say that's part of why I think the web automation experience seems to me to be a little richer and a little more forgiving than the desktop automation process is. I'm sure Microsoft's evolving it, but that's my general reaction. Now, on the desktop recording side, there are also some oddities with the user experience there. For example, if you say, oh, I want to go open this Excel file. Well, what a user might do is you might go, okay, well, open Microsoft Excel. Oh, there's a file. It's at the top of my recently opened files list. I'm going to click that. Well, guess what? When you play that back 3 months from now, that's not going to be at the top of your recently opened items list anymore. And because of that, you're going to open the wrong file and potentially overwrite stuff or cause crashes or whatever it is. So you kind of got to know your way around it and test things out carefully, because that situation I just shared with you might play back in debug mode flawlessly. And not until you actually start using it in production and things are changing does that actually change on you. So understand that there's a few little gotchas with it. Okay, so we've talked about the first two pieces of this, but how do we actually put this in production? Because all you've really seen so far is how to record and play back one off. But you've not seen, how do I automate this so that when I'm closing out 30 of those opportunities per day, how is it going to open the right opportunity and grab the information from that and add that specific record to accounting and repeat and repeat and repeat on an automated basis? So all you've done so far is the initial design step. Now you have to set up the parameters that this will run under. So the good news is, if you already know Power Automate, you already know how to do this. All you really do is you create a standard Power Automate, and that can be a scheduled daily Power Automate. It can be a button Power Automate. It can be automated based on a trigger power, whatever it is. It can trigger however you want it to trigger. And within that Power Automate, you're going to call the UI flow or flows, in our case, that you created, and you're going to wire up the variables to make those two UI flows talk to each other. So high-level summary of what we're going to do is, we're going to create a Power Automate the way we normally would. Within it, we're going to call that first UI flow and say, go get information from this web application. Then when that's done, we're going to call the second UI flow and say, go put information into this desktop application. Let's take a look at how that works. So over here, you can see this is my trigger. So what I'm doing is I'm calling the common data service. This might be a model-driven app. In our case, it's Dynamics, which is just a fancy model-driven app. When a record is selected, and then I'm going to say what instance and what's the entity name. So to explain what that's doing there, what's the triggering event? When a record is selected in the common data model, what that does is it will put this flow as a user callable flow into the user interface. If you remember my demo I did, while I was on the opportunity, I clicked the drop down and I said flows. It gave me a list of all the flows that can be run against an opportunity, and I selected this flow. That's how this gets put into the selection list. By setting it up this way, I said, I'm going to let the user call this every time they do something. Don't have to do it that way, just the way I chose to do it this time. I could fully automate it on save of an opportunity if I wanted to. Okay, so now I've created my standard Power Automate. I've got my triggering event. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to run a UI flow. And you see I've got my different types of UI flows I can run right down here. So first one I'm going to run is a UI flow for the web. And it reminds me that's a premium connector. Now, this is probably the trickiest thing to set up. Again, it's a one-time per machine setup, but for these to work in production, when you're designing them and just playing them, not fully running them, you do not need this. But once you actually want this to run in production, you have to install an on-premise data gateway on that machine. Now, that machine can be my individual machine if I want to run it in the context of a user. It can be a workstation sitting out there somewhere else in the office. It can be a virtual machine sitting in Azure, whatever you want it to be. But whatever machine it is or machines they are, each of them needs to have an on-premise data gateway. That basically just says, I'm going to allow the Microsoft Cloud to connect to this machine to move information back and forth between things. And I'll just say it's a little tricky to set it up. But the very first time you say, I'm going to connect to a UI flow, it's going to prompt you and say, install this on-premise data gateway. This might be an area you get hung up. There's tons of great information online, both the Microsoft docs, as well as people trying to resolve these and helping each other in various different online forums. So you can hack your way through it if you need to. Reach out to me if you run into this and you have any issues. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I've made my way through it a few times. So again, one time only. As you do this, you say, I want to call a UI flow. It's going to go timeout. You don't have an on-premise data gateway on your machine yet. So go ahead and install one. Go through the process of installing it, and then you can build the rest of this out. So as you get into it, you've already seen, we just talked about, here's my triggering event. And now I'm just going to call these two UI flows. What does that look like? Triggering event we already looked at. Now that I've installed the on-premise data gateway, I now say, okay, run a UI flow for the web. Remember, that's one type of Selenium type. And I just entered the basic information you would expect. What's the name of this UI flow? Whatever I named this one when I created it. What else do we have here? What web browser do I want to run it in? What's my run mode? So you can run attended or unattended. So attended means literally, I will sit there as a user and I will watch this run. It will happen before my eyes. Kind of cool. I might be able to trigger something immediately to just say, sit back, relax. I'm going to take a minute and a half to enter stuff that would have taken you 10 minutes to do, and I'm going to do it flawlessly instead of you worrying about did I copy and paste all this stuff correctly or not. Unattended means this can just run on its own. So I might have a workstation sitting there saying, hey, I'm going to watch, and when an opportunity gets saved, that user doesn't have to see anything or do anything. I'm going to get triggered over here as this workstation to run it unattended, or it can even run unattended on my machine. So I can say I go away for lunch, I'm not sitting there watching it, and it's going to run all of my workflows, all of my UI flows for me automatically. The last thing it's asking for down here is any inputs that I declared within this web app. Now, if you remember, almost everything I did on the web app is an output, right? It's stuff I want to grab from the application. But I did declare one input. I said, I want a URL that might change every time, because the opportunity I did the recording around is never going to be the actual opportunity that's calling this. So I just said, here's the URL. And I put in all the normal URL stuff except for the ID, the GUID field for the URL. I put instead this opportunity field here. Where did it get that? Just up here. So I said, when a record is selected, what kind of record? An opportunity record. Power Automate remembers, here's the ID of that opportunity. And I can just put that right here and say, now open that opportunity record up to do your thing. So it runs that. And then it goes on to the third step, right? This run a UI flow for desktop. So in this case, what it's doing is it's saying, okay, I'm gonna run this UI flow. I tell it which UI flow it is. I choose a run mode again, and then here are all the input variables that I declared. Now, though, because I have all these running in the same context as one another, I can have access to all the output variables from this to plug in here as input variables into this. So it's copying and pasting. It's actually not even copying and pasting. It's literally rekeying that information just as if I were a user sitting at the keyboard. And I do have one hard-coded thing down here. My file name never changes. So I just put that down here. In the event it does change, I can come here and edit it if I need to, but it's not something I have to ask the user for every time or anything like that. So there it is. I run that, and it's off to the races. This is now available for me to run. And basically, this is everything I needed to create that little video recording I showed you at the beginning of this session, where the computer did all the work. I sat back and watched. Now, I did one thing wrong here. Pretty wrong, actually, and this might give you a hint, but does anybody want to take a guess? You can unmute your mic at what I did wrong that should be done differently in this case. Okay, no worries if you don't. Just thought I'd throw it out there to get a little bit of engagement, or at least to wake you up. Hey, you asked a question. What's going on? So here's what I did wrong. Remember, I created this web app, this web UI flow to copy information from that web application. I did not need to do that at all. Why did I need to do that? Because Dynamics 365 or any Power App, model-driven Power App, has an API connector. I don't need to scrape information off of the screen from there. I can just call the API to get that information, and that's faster, more reliable, easier to maintain. So let's go through real quickly. Well, how does that work? How is that different? How do I combine these things in one place? So you remember, this is how we put our Power Automate together. All we're doing is we're changing one thing. Instead of having a UI flow to grab information out of a model-driven app, we're just using standard Power Automate steps, flow steps to capture web data. Then we still call the UI flow to enter the information into the desktop, assuming the desktop doesn't have an API. Yes, in our example, it was Microsoft Excel, but our hypothetical example was it's some other application that we don't have an API for. How does that look? Pretty simple to set up. You already saw how we did all of this to set up our UI flow that connected one UI flow on the web to another UI flow on the desktop, and it gets called by a standard Power Automate. When we change that to follow best practices, it looks like this. So different steps, a few less steps in some cases, a few new different things to think about. So our overall outline over here is just this. I still do the same trigger event when a record is created, so the user can still call this. Now remember, this item says, I know what record the user was on when they called it. It was a specific opportunity, but I don't know all the information about the account and contact. So let's go get the account that it's related to, and let's go get the contact that it's related to, so I have access to all those fields in the rest of my Power Automate. And then I call the UI flow for desktop, just like I did before. The only difference is now over here, you can kind of see here's where I got the account and contact information. Now over here, all these fields, all these inputs that are going into the desktop application, they actually came out of this. When you watch these play back, the first thing you'll know is this is way more efficient. Literally opening up the application and watching it navigate between different forms and kind of grab stuff off those forms, those are taking cycle times. You're watching it as a user happen. You saw it in the little video I played at the beginning of this. It is not a super speedy process. I'm sure it will get faster, but it's not super speedy. API access, very, very efficient access. Maintaining this, debugging this, evolving this over time, much, much easier to do than if I were trying to maintain the separate UI flow. So I still use a UI flow, but only for that application that does not have an easy API connector to get and put information to and from it with. Okay, so circling back now, I talked about two ways to create these, right? I talked about the Selenium IDE for creating your web UI flows, and I talked about the desktop interface to create your Windows-based UI flows. But as you saw at the top of that, the newer one is called a Power Automate Desktop. It is still in preview mode, but I want to talk about that, and I'll talk about why I want to talk about it in a couple of slides here. So in this example, I'm actually giving you somewhat of a real-life example here. One of our clients said, look, we just got a new mandate from the Department of Labor because our employees and contractors are always going into government buildings. They do a lot of work in the school system. So higher education and grade school, high school, middle school, their contractors are always going in there to do work. With COVID coming out, the government basically said, look, we need to keep tabs on who is going in and out of these locations. So if there's an incident, we can hopefully rapidly track it down to avoid bigger problems down the road. So what they said was, whenever somebody goes into one of these facilities, you need to fill out this form, this web form we've created for you, so we know who was here and what day they were here and how many hours they were here for. So this client already had a time entry system basically inside of Dynamics 365. So that was the good news. The bad news was these government forms had no API associated with it at all. It was going to be a huge amount of manual data entry because they had hundreds of contractors going to schools all over the country every single day. They sized it and said, we're looking at least 3, possibly more full-time people just to do data entry, to get reports out of this app that we have for time entry and key it into this government form that's not a very friendly form to key data into. So their solution was UI flows. So let's look at how that worked. And I'm going to actually show you just a mock-up that we did, sort of a proof of concept that kind of gives you the big picture idea. And it only took me, by the way, a little while to set it up. So you guys know, I literally said, I need to get into this newer version for today's session. I hadn't talked on it before, did not have time to do it until this morning. Canceled all my morning meetings, delved into it, and put this together for you relatively quickly. So the actual production one we developed in the old world, but this is how it would work in the new world. That's my way of saying this is not very intimidating to get into. Once you know how UI flows work, this, while yes, a different application, has a lot of similarities to it. So the first thing I did was I said, I created a little data entry form over there on the right to say, here's a government data entry form. That's not the government form. That's just one I created in Microsoft Forms. And then I said, okay, I need to create a Power Automate desktop application to key stuff into this form. So what I did was, I first of all said, let's create my input variables here. So these are inputs into my application. They're not inputs into the form. They're going to be outputs into the form eventually. But I'm saying here's inputs that I'm going to use to play back and put into that form. So I declared these input fields here, and you can kind of see the names of them here so that they're available to me. Then I just went through and I clicked the web recorder button in this case. By the way, notice that this has a web recorder and a desktop recorder, one application to do both things instead of 2 different applications for those. I clicked the web recorder and I basically just went into this form and filled it out. I didn't, right click, or I just kind of typed all my information into it. And as I did that, it put all of my keystrokes over here and basically said, you open this web page in Chrome, here's what you entered in each one of these different fields, and they were just standard things. Then all I had to do was double click on each one of these things, open it up, highlight that hard-coded value that I entered, like Jeff, my name, highlight that, click the little function next to it, pick the first name field and say, I want the first name field to go in there. Okay, great. Went through each one of those, done. And at the very end, I clicked the submit button and I was done. I now record this, it's all there and available for me to access. But now I have to populate those fields, right? I have variables, I have inputs, got to put something into those inputs. So the next thing I did was actually created a really simple model-driven app. This was on Dynamics, but it's how a model-driven app would look, however you created it, just to do the basic time entry collection here. So I've got a username here, an owner in this case. I key in a location, I key in a date, I key in how long I was at the location. Wasn't at that one very long. And I have as many of those coming in as I want. Then I create my overall Power Automate over here. So here's my UI flow down here at the very bottom, but let's go through each one of these steps. So at the very top, first of all, I said, this is a recurrence. I'm going to run it every 24 hours. Don't have to do it that way. Remember last time I had the user trigger it manually. This time I said I'm going to have it run daily. I could also have it run in real time. As each individual time entry comes in, I could actually have it open, run, and put that out there for me. But I said, let's do it once a day to allow approvals and all that kind of stuff to happen. So then I said, okay, the next thing I need to do is I need to get a list of records from my time entry entity in my model-driven app. So I said, go get all those records. I used a fetch XML query to say, just give me the ones from the last 24 hours. So I've got my list. To that list, I'm going to apply to each of them these 2 steps. So the first step is I'm basically going to say, go get the user record. So the user record is which user owns this time entry, because I need their first and last name to key it into that application. So I get that user record. The next thing I do is I say, now call that UI flow, and here are all my inputs. So all this data comes right out of my model-driven app, and I key it directly into that web form. And again, it runs all those steps I had. So it says at the end of it, click submit. And it continues to do it because it applies this for each. So if I have 150 records for the state, it's going to loop around this 150 times, entering all that information into that government form for me. And by the way, you can also do this with PDFs. I haven't experimented with a lot of them, but I've played with a few. So if someone says, you have to fill out this PDF every time, and you have to email that PDF to this address, or you have to drop it in that FTP site, You can do all of that stuff as well. So super, super powerful stuff you can do, not necessarily just with Power Automate Desktop. The other ones may allow you to do that too. So very powerful, one place where you're getting everything done. In that example, I just looked at a web application using Power Automate Desktop, but it does work on desktop too. So some of this is my impression of where Power Automate Desktop, this third, more recent version, is going. It may not be totally accurate. Don't hold me to it. But it does look like it is the evolution of Softomotive's Win Automate. Remember, that's the thing that Microsoft bought back in the spring and then started rolling in to Power Automate that they announced at Ignite a couple of months ago. I think now Softomotive Win Automate is officially gone. You used to be able to briefly, after Microsoft bought them, download it and run it as part of your Power Automate licensing. I believe now the approach will be use Power Automate Desktop for these things. It is still in preview. It's still, and it does show sometimes. So I certainly had some moments of gritting my teeth this morning, wondering if I would pull this off in time for our session this afternoon. But it's pretty darn powerful, even though it is still in preview. So a lot of stuff, it could do everything I put into there. I just had to navigate some hurdles that I wouldn't have expected, but it's in preview, so I probably should have expected them. It's very similar to the other two UI flow approaches. Yes, the user interface is different. The editing and troubleshooting, debugging experience is different, but the way you integrate it with overall Power Automates, very, very similar. I just add it as another thing, and within a regular Power Automate, I say, call this Power Automate Desktop UI flow, pass my variables into it, and it's off to the races. I believe, and I put the question mark here in big type because I'm not sure, I believe this is probably going to be the future of UI flows because we know Softomotive was this highly rated, near the magic quadrant thing that I think Microsoft wants to leverage. And I see a lot of the power in it alone that is separated in the other two options. So to me, if you need something that's rock solid in production now, you may not yet be ready for Power Automate Desktop, but what we are doing from now on is saying we're going here first to see if we can build it in that, because we believe that is where Microsoft is going to be making its investments and improving. And it's probably the more stable platform for the long term. I could be wrong. Maybe all three will be there for many, many years to come. But this is what I'm kind of betting on us putting our time into. So some concluding remarks here for you to just think about. Remember, business process automation is API-based automation, right? So taking information out of a Microsoft form, putting it into a SharePoint list or a Power App, right? All done via API, very efficient. You don't need to look at the screen or key things in or anything like that. RPA, robotic process automation, is user interface based automation. It's using the keyboard, it's using the screen, it's even using the mouse. Anything the user can do, it's doing. And an example that we've seen is moving data out of maybe one system that does have an API and into maybe another system that does not. Or even more relevant, moving data between multiple systems that don't have an API. So there's huge potential to do that. Where I think Power Automate and UI flows in general really shine is you can do both in one place. So there are a lot of other RPA vendors out there. Softomotive was one that Microsoft bought up. There's others you saw in the Magic Quadrant that at present are still more highly rated. But what most of them do not have is the huge number of BPA connectors that Microsoft already has in Power Automate. That's huge. That's super powerful. When you have an RPA solution without those connectors, you're doing everything manually. But when you've got those worlds coming together in one place, now you say, if there's an API, by all means, leverage it. But if there's not, I've got something else available that I can do almost anything else I can imagine with. So very, very, very powerful to bring those together. So when do you want to do each? First of all, I'd say RPA is kind of the last option for you, right? If there's no other way to do something that's more elegant, that's easier to maintain, then go to RPA. The reality is there are a lot of things that fit into that bucket. So when you don't have an API, or with integrating with the out-of-the-box API or the available API is too timely or cost prohibitive for you to do, when IT resources have a 6-month backlog and you need automation today, those are things you think about maybe for your RPA targets. Some real life ones, you saw one, submitting information out of an application to a form that's on a portal somewhere or in a PDF or something like that. Another one that someone shared with us is there are parts of Microsoft and Dynamics, Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365 administrative experience that aren't automated yet. So when you're bulk adding a bunch of users, sometimes there's still manual pieces of that process that you can't automate. But if you can put those users into Excel with the key attributes that you need to make sure you have, you can automatically start to create those users in Microsoft 365, give them the apps that they're supposed to have, give them access to certain things, go over to Dynamics 365, give them the security roles they're supposed to have, all without lifting a finger. Another powerful application we've seen is scraping information from a website. So a lot of our clients do a lot of online research and certain online, you can call it databases, and they're literally opening, doing a search, finding information, copying fields off of a form, and pasting it into Dynamics in their case. Well, they don't need to do that anymore. So the list goes on and on. There's all sorts of things. The best way I can say it is, if you look at something saying, this is something that is repetitive, and so therefore should be able to be automated, RPA can probably solve some or all of the problem. The only question is there another way that could also solve it about as elegantly and about as much time? And if there's not, RPA is a way to go. There's a limitless number of applications for it. So summarizing our overall process here, remember, once you've decided on using a UI flow, it's the 3 R's: record, refine, and run in production. The bigger picture of that is, on your journey to deciding to use UI flows, remember, this still requires listening to users. You're probably not going to have power users who are so adept that you just say, there's UI flows, go use them. God love you. I hope it goes well. You still need to be that awesome internal or external consultant to say, I really need to listen to this person and understand their problem thoroughly. Not only do I need to understand them, I need to bring the subject matter expertise to say, is this the right tool to solve their problem, or is there something else out there? Then you connect the solution to their problem. Connect is where the record, refine, and run process takes place. And go into it expecting maintenance. Like anything else, expect this to be somewhat of a moving target. We've not been doing this long enough to know this for sure, but I suspect more maintenance will be needed on UI flows than typical Power Automate flows. And I suspect that because user interfaces change faster than APIs do, right? So if you automate something coming out of a website and someone decides to remove a field off of a form or redesign a form completely or create a new URL or who knows what, all of a sudden it's not going to work anymore. Whereas if you have an API, yes, those change, but they tend to change at a slower pace than user interfaces do. So be prepared for that. Know that that's coming. Couple last comments, and then I'll turn it over for questions. It looks like we've got just a couple of minutes left. But if you want to learn more about the luck principle that I mentioned earlier, there's a book you can grab on Amazon that talks all about how to create better human connections in the digital age. We do a lot with Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365. We've got little Teams downloadable there for you if you want to get the latest governance best practices on deploying Microsoft Teams. Happy to give you a free copy of that. And this is what we do. So if we can help you guys at all, please reach out. Let me know. There's my contact info there. You can, that's my Twitter handle. My name is pretty unique. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn if you want to find me there. So let me leave it at that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and check the chat and open it up for any questions. So thank you. Somebody said thank you. Thank you back. Appreciate that. And if there are any questions, feel free to unmute or type them in the chat if you prefer to engage that way, but happy to help however I can.
Jeff, that was really, really informative. I mean, I even have kind of an idea of a lot of what that stuff was, and I think it filled in a lot of gaps for me of some of the stuff of kind of what to use when and what makes sense and what's coming. So I just thank you so much for going over that in detail. I could listen to you talk all day, but I think it was very, very helpful.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's what I was going for.
Does anybody have any specific questions for Jeff while he's on the phone about the RPA process or about anything he talked about today?
That free ebook, how do I go about getting that, Jeff? For
Teams? The free ebook, just you can just email me.
Okay.
You want me? Did you get that? Do you want me to share that out again?
Would you mind? I don't.
Can you put it in the chat? Just stick it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put it in chat.
Thank you.
And
thank you. The class was interesting, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you.
read The Luck Principle, and it's an amazing book. So if you guys have a chance, definitely go out there and get yourself a copy of it. Any other questions from anybody? We got about a minute left. All right, well, we'll stick around for another minute or so. Jeff, thanks once again for coming and sharing your time and your talents with us. Everybody else, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us this month. Just a reminder, like I said, next month we will meet, same as we always do, the second Tuesday, 11:30 Central. But we're all just kind of gonna get together, visit, you know, do a little networking. So feel free to kind of come and go as you please. We'll just leave the line open and people can pop in and say hi. If you guys need anything else in the meantime, you all know where to find me. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving in November, and hopefully see you next month.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Jeff.
Bye
Bye,
all. Thanks for having me.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a happy Monday.